The wind was the only constant companion Boone Coulter had known for years. It was a sculptor and a thief, carving the red rock of the Arizona borderlands into skeletal fingers that clawed at a perpetually bruised sky, and stealing the warmth from a man's bones the moment he stepped from the meager shade of his porch. Tonight, it howled a lonely sermon across the high desert, carrying grit that sandblasted the weathered gray wood of his failing ranch house. Above, a full moon hung like a silver dollar in a starless, ink-black sky, its light cold and unforgiving. It offered no warmth, only illumination, laying bare the decay of Boone's world, the splintered rails of the corral, the sway-backed roof of the barn, and the small, solitary cabin that looked more like a tomb than a home. Inside, the silence was as heavy as a shroud, broken only by the rhythmic creak of floorboards as Boone moved through the cramped space. He favored his left leg, the one the Apache arrow had found 7 years ago. The wound had healed, but the pain remained, a dull, persistent ache that sharpened with the cold and settled deep in his hip. It was a constant reminder of the ambush, of the screams of men he'd fought beside, and of the profound, isolating guilt of being a survivor. He leaned heavily on a hickory walking stick, its wood worn smooth by his palm. He'd just come in from the barn, having tended to old Samson, his one remaining horse. The gelding had a lame foreleg, a mirror to Boone's own affliction, and a bond of shared brokenness had formed between them. He'd rubbed the horse's leg with liniment, his calloused hands moving with a gentle reverence he rarely allowed himself to feel for anything, let alone another living soul. The smell of horse and liniment and dry hay still clung to his worn denim clothes. On the rough-hewn table, next to a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a tin plate from a dinner of cold beans, lay the letter. It had arrived 2 days ago, carried by a dust-caked mail rider who had looked at Boone with the same mixture of pity and suspicion as everyone else in the nearby town of Redemption. The paper was creased and smudged with the grime of a long journey, but the words written in a neat, official script were clear enough. Asterisk Mr. Coulter. Asterisk, in response to your advertisement placed with the Matrimonial Gazette of St. Louis, we are pleased to inform you that a suitable candidate has been secured. Mrs. Magda Sorensen, a widow of good standing from Nebraska, has accepted your proposal and passage has been arranged. She is expected to arrive on the 3:15 train in Redemption on the 4th of October, 1891. Asterisk, asterisk, we wish you a prosperous union. Asterisk, sincerely. Asterisk, asterisk, the Office of Domestic Arrangements. Asterisk, the 4th of October. That was tomorrow. Boone stared at the letter, then poured a measure of whiskey into his cup. The raw spirit burned a familiar path down his throat. A wife. The idea felt foreign, an ill-fitting garment on a man who had long since grown accustomed to the rough hide of solitude. He hadn't sent for a wife out of any romantic delusion. Love was a fantasy peddled in dime novels, a luxury for men with 2 good legs and a future not stained with blood. He was 34 years old, but felt 100. The high desert sun had etched deep lines around his eyes and mouth, and his soul felt just as weathered. No, he hadn't sought a partner for his heart. He had sought a pair of hands. He'd finally admitted it to himself one brutal afternoon last spring, after he'd spent the better part of a day trying to reshingle a section of the cabin roof. His leg had given out as he climbed the ladder, sending him tumbling to the hard-packed earth. He'd lain there for a full 10 minutes, the wind knocked out of him, staring up at the vast, indifferent sky, the hammer still clutched in his hand. It was the crushing weight of his own limitations that had finally broken through his stubborn pride. He couldn't do it all alone. Not anymore. The ranch, inherited from a father he barely remembered, was crumbling around him. The fences needed mending, the well pump was fickle, and the small plot he tried to farm yielded more rocks than vegetables. He needed someone strong, someone who wouldn't be scared off by the hardship or the silence, someone to cook a hot meal so he didn't have to subsist on beans and jerky, someone to share the relentless burden of survival. And if he was being truly honest with himself, In the dead of night when the nightmares came and he woke up sweating and shaking, he needed someone to simply be there, a presence in the house to push back against the suffocating loneliness that threatened to swallow him whole. So he'd done it. He'd ridden into town, endured the stares, and sent the carefully worded letter and the money order. He'd asked for a woman of sturdy constitution and practical skills, making no mention of beauty or affection. He was making a business transaction, acquiring a partner for the enterprise of living. He expected a plain, hardened woman, perhaps a spinster past her prime or a widow with no other prospects. It didn't matter what she looked like, as long as she could work. The next afternoon, he hitched old Samson to the buckboard and began the slow, jarring journey into redemption. The town was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the wilderness, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast emptiness surrounding them. As he drove down the main thoroughfare, heads turned, doors opened a crack. He saw the whispers pass from the women gathered outside the general store, their eyes raking over him with cold assessment. He was the town recluse, the damaged soldier who'd come back from the Apache Wars not a hero, but a ghost. His most pointed glares came, as always, from the Tucker family. Jedediah Tucker owned the largest cattle operation in the county and considered Boone's small ranch an irritating blight on his ambitions. He was a big, florid man with a cruel mouth and eyes like chips of granite. He stood on the porch of the saloon, his son Caleb beside him. Caleb was a younger, meaner version of his father, with a swagger that promised violence. "Well, look what the wind blew in," Caleb sneered, loud enough for half the street to hear. "Thought you died, and the buzzards just hadn't found you yet. Coulter—" Boone kept his gaze fixed straight ahead, his hands tight on the reins. He knew what they wanted. They'd been trying to buy him out for years, first with lowball offers, then with veiled threats. They wanted his water rights, meager as they were. "Leave him be, son," Jedediah said, though there was no kindness in his voice. "The man's come to town. Must be a special occasion. Maybe his leg's grown back." The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. Boone felt a familiar, hot rage coil in his gut, but he choked it down. A fight would solve nothing. It would only give them an excuse. He pulled the buckboard to a halt near the train station and tethered Samson, his movements stiff and deliberate. He refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him hurry, or seeing him limp any more than he had to. The 3:15 train was late, of course. Everything in this part of the country ran on its own time. Boone waited on the splintered wooden platform, his back to the town, his gaze fixed on the shimmering iron tracks that disappeared into the heat-hazed distance. He felt a knot of apprehension tighten in his stomach. What if she took one look at him, at his leg, at this god-forsaken dust bowl of a town, and got right back on the next train heading east? He wouldn't blame her. Then he heard it. A low, distant whistle that grew into the chuffing, clanking roar of a steam engine. A plume of black smoke smudged the horizon. The ground began to vibrate slightly. The train, a great black iron beast, hissed and groaned as it slowed, pulling into the station with a final, deafening screech of brakes and a great sigh of steam. A few passengers disembarked, a slick-haired salesman with a sample case, a family with 3 small, dusty children. Boone scanned their faces, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. He was looking for a plain woman, someone who looked like she knew what a hard day's work was. And then the last passenger stepped down. Boone's first thought was that there had been a mistake, a terrible, monumental mistake. The woman who descended from the carriage had to duck her head to clear the doorway. She was tall. Not just tall for a woman, but tall for a man. She had to be close to 6'3", maybe more. Her shoulders, visible even under the worn fabric of her dress, were broad and square. The dress itself, a pale floral print that might have been pretty on a smaller woman, was stretched taut across her full bosom and wide hips. looking comically, painfully tight. It was a dress made for a delicate flower, worn by a towering oak tree. She set a single, battered suitcase on the platform. Her hands were large, the knuckles prominent, the fingers long and capable-looking. Her face, framed by thick braids of pale blonde hair coiled at the back of her head, was not conventionally pretty. It was a strong face, with a wide mouth, a straight nose, and high cheekbones. There were faint scars on her temple and a small, white line that cut through one of her eyebrows. Her skin was weathered from sun and wind, but it was her eyes that held Boone captive. They were a clear, startling blue, and as they swept the platform, they seemed to hold a strange combination of weary apprehension and a quiet, unyielding strength. She saw him. Their eyes met across the dusty platform. He saw a flicker of something in their depths. Assessment, perhaps, and a hint of shyness that seemed at odds with her formidable size. He knew he was staring, but he couldn't help it. This was not the sturdy, plain woman he had envisioned. This was a giantess, a Valkyrie strayed from some northern myth and stranded in the Arizona desert. He forced his legs to move, his limp more pronounced than ever. He felt small and inadequate as he approached her, his hickory stick thumping a dull beat on the planks. He stopped a few feet away, suddenly aware of his own frayed collar, the dust on his hat, the weary lines on his own face. "Mrs. Sorensen?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She gave a curt nod. Her gaze dropped for a moment to his cane, then to his bad leg, before returning to his face. There was no pity in her eyes, only observation. "Mr. Coulter," she replied. Her voice was deeper than he expected, with a faint, melodic accent he couldn't place. Scandinavian, perhaps. An awkward silence stretched between them, thick with the afternoon heat and the curious stares from the townspeople who had lingered to watch the spectacle. Boone cleared his throat, searching for something, anything to say. "Welcome to redemption." She offered a small, hesitant smile. It was a transformative thing. It softened the harsh lines of her face and lit a spark of warmth in her blue eyes. "It is a long way from Nebraska," she said simply. "I'll get your bag," he mumbled, reaching for the suitcase. He loaded it onto the back of the buckboard, his movements clumsy. When he turned back, she was looking past him, her gaze fixed on the hardscrabble landscape beyond the town, the endless expanse of rock and dust that was now her home. He wondered what she was thinking, if she was already regretting her decision. The ride back to the ranch was mostly silent. The rhythmic clop of Sampson's hooves and the squeak of the wagon wheels were the only sounds. Boone pointed out a landmark or two, his words feeling clumsy and useless in the vast silence. She just nodded, her hands folded in the lap of her too-tight dress, her expression unreadable. When they finally crested the last rise and the ranch came into view, nestled in its shallow valley, Boone felt a hot flush of shame. Through her eyes, he saw it for what it truly was, a dilapidated shack and a broken-down barn on a patch of worthless land. It was a testament to his failure. He pulled the buckboard to a stop in front of the cabin and killed the engine of his courage. He couldn't bring himself to look at her. He watched as she looked at the small, weathered cabin. Her head tilted. It was barely big enough for one person, let alone two, especially when one of them was her size. The porch sagged. The windows were grimy. This was what she had traveled over 1,000 miles for. He braced himself for the disappointment, the tears, or even the anger. Magda turned her head and looked at him. That strange, shy smile touched her lips again. But this time it held a glint of something else, a spark of wry humor, of a knowing, earthy pragmatism that took him completely by surprise. Her blue eyes crinkled at the corners as they met his. "It's too small," she said, her low voice carrying on the dry wind. Then, she added, with a wicked little quirk of her lips, "But I'll manage tonight." A jolt went through Boone, sharp and unexpected. It wasn't just the words, but the way she said them. A plain statement of fact laced with a subtle, teasing warmth that was at once both comical and deeply, startlingly sensual. He felt a flush creep up his neck. He was a man who had faced down Apache warriors and the barrel of a gun without flinching. Yet the shy, wicked smile of this giant of a woman had completely and utterly unmanned him. He could only stare, speechless, as she swung herself down from the buckboard with surprising grace, ready to begin her new life. Magda moved through the one-room cabin with the quiet, deliberate force of a river. Boone, feeling useless and strangely intrusive in his own home, sat at the table, pretending to clean a saddle strap while he watched her. She explored the small space, not with the timidity of a guest, but with the assessing eye of a general surveying a new command post. Her large hands, which he'd first judged as merely capable, ran over the rough-hewn wood of the walls, tested the latch on the single window, and assessed the crumbling mortar of the stone fireplace with an expert's touch. There was a profound lack of fuss about her. She didn't complain about the years of accumulated dust that coated every surface, or the musty smell of disuse and loneliness that clung to the air. Instead, she tied a spare kerchief over her blonde braids, rolled up the sleeves of her worn dress to reveal thick, muscular forearms, and began to work. She moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. She took the single thin blanket from the bed and the threadbare rug from the floor, carrying them outside and beating them against the fence post with powerful, rhythmic thuds that sent clouds of dust billowing into the stark sunlight. The sound was strangely vital, a heartbeat being forced back into a place that had been dormant for too long. She found a bucket and a brush, and with water she hauled herself from the well. She began to scrub. The hands that could likely wrestle a steer to a standstill were surprisingly delicate as she worked around the warped floorboards and into the grimy corners. Boone watched, a knot of shame and something else, something akin to awe, tightening in his chest. He had lived in this squalor, had become so accustomed to it that he'd ceased to see it. She was scouring away not just the dirt, but the physical manifestation of his own long neglect. In less than an hour, the air in the cabin had changed. It smelled of damp wood, harsh soap, and clean air. The stale scent of his solitude finally chased into the corners. When she was done, she turned her attention to the small pantry. The shelves were meagerly stocked. A sack of flour, a tin of coffee, some dried beans, and a string of jerky. Her broad shoulders slumped just a fraction of an inch, the only sign of any potential disappointment, but then she straightened, her practical nature taking over once more. She took down the jerky and a handful of beans, found the last of the wild onions Boone had gathered weeks ago, and set a pot of water over the hearth. Soon, a new smell began to fill the cabin, one Boone couldn't remember ever gracing its walls before. It was the rich, savory aroma of a proper meal being cooked. It was more than just the smell of soup. It was the smell of a home. He found himself closing his eyes, inhaling deeply. It was a scent from a life he thought he'd left behind forever, a memory of his mother from a time before the war, before the wound, before the silence. A painful lump formed in his throat, and he had to turn away, busying himself again with the saddle strap so she wouldn't see the unexpected moisture gathering in his eyes. She served the soup in 2 chipped enamel bowls. It was a simple, humble meal, nothing more than rehydrated meat, beans, and onions in a thin broth. But to Boone, it tasted like a feast. They sat opposite each other at the small table, the newly cleaned surface gleaming between them. The sun had set, casting the world outside in shades of deep indigo and purple, and the only light in the cabin came from a single oil lamp Magda had lit. Its flame cast a warm, golden glow, a kind light that softened the hard lines of their faces and danced in the depths of Magda's blue eyes. The silence at the table was thick and awkward. It was a different kind of silence than the one Boone was used to. His was an empty, dead thing. This one was alive, filled with the unspoken questions and wary assessments of two complete strangers bound together by a piece of paper. The only sounds were the scrape of their spoons against the bowls and the soft hiss of the lamp. "This is good," Boone said, the words feeling loud and clumsy in the quiet room. Magda looked up from her bowl, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. "It is only jerky." "Still, it's good," he insisted. And then, feeling a need to explain the depth of his gratitude, he added, "It's been a long time since I had a hot meal I didn't burn myself." A small smile touched her lips. It was the shy one this time, not the wicked one from the platform. It made her look younger, more vulnerable. A man alone forgets such things. "He does," Boone agreed, and they fell silent again. But the silence felt a little less heavy this time. After the meal, the pressing, unavoidable reality of the sleeping arrangements settled between them. The cabin contained only one bed, a narrow rope cot pressed against the far wall with a thin, lumpy mattress that was barely adequate for one man, let alone a woman of her stature. It was, Boone realized with another flush of shame, too small in every conceivable way. Magda looked from Boone to the bed, her expression unreadable in the flickering lamplight. She took in its narrow frame, its meager coverings. Boone braced himself. This, surely, would be the final indignity, the one that would break her formidable composure. She met his gaze, a weary sort of pragmatism in her eyes. "It's small," she stated, her voice flat and matter-of-fact. She paused, and for a moment Boone thought she might finally voice a complaint. Instead, she gave a short, almost imperceptible sigh and added, "But I've had worse." The simple declaration, devoid of self-pity, struck Boone harder than any complaint could have. What kind of life had she led where this pathetic cot was an improvement? "You take the bed," he said quickly. "It's not much, but you've traveled far. I can sleep by the fire." She shook her head, a firm, resolute gesture. "No, this is your home. I will not put you from your own bed." Before he could argue, she took the blanket she had beaten clean earlier and spread it on the floorboards near the hearth, fashioning a pallet for herself. Her movements were efficient, final. There was no room for debate. Later, lying in the darkness, Boone found he couldn't sleep. The familiar creaks and groans of the cabin were now joined by a new sound, the soft, rhythmic breathing of another person. It was a profound and unsettling intimacy. He was acutely aware of her, a large, warm presence just a few feet away on the floor. He felt like an intruder in the landscape of his own loneliness. After an hour of staring at the moonlit ceiling, he heard her stir. She wasn't waking, she was dreaming. A soft, liquid murmur escaped her lips, the words unintelligible. She was speaking in her sleep, not in English, but in that melodic, foreign tongue he'd heard in her accent. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was one of deep, aching sorrow. It was a sound of pleading, of a quiet, desperate grief. In that moment, she wasn't a giantess or a capable farmhand. She was a woman haunted by ghosts of her own. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk. The cold was a physical thing, a creature that lived in the walls of the Nebraska farmhouse. It seeped through the floorboards and clung to her skin, a constant companion through the long, white winters. Her husband, Anders, was a man carved from that same cold. He was a devout, humorless man who read the Bible every night and saw sin in every shadow. He had chosen her not for her heart or her face, but for her size. A good, strong back for work, and wide hips for sons, he had declared to his father, his voice full of satisfaction, as if he were discussing the merits of a new prize broodmare. Asterisk. She had been his wife, but she had never been his partner. She was another one of his possessions, like his land or his livestock, something to be worked and commanded. He took his husbandly rights in the dark, with a grim, silent efficiency that was more violating than any passionate violence. There was no tenderness in his touch, only a sense of duty and ownership. Her body was a vessel for his needs and his legacy. Her thoughts, her feelings, her dreams, those were of no consequence. Asterisk. He never hit her. His cruelty was quieter, a constant erosion of her spirit. He called her clumsy when she broke a dish, stupid when she miscounted the chickens, and barren when, after 3 years, her womb remained empty. She learned to move through his house like a ghost, to make herself small despite her size, to swallow her words and her tears. She found her only solace in work, in the burn of her muscles as she split firewood or hauled water, in the simple, honest fatigue that allowed her a few hours of dreamless sleep. Being unloved was a slow death, a hollowing out from the inside until all that was left was a resilient, aching emptiness. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Boone woke to the first pale light of dawn. For a moment, he was disoriented. The air in the cabin was cool and fresh, and the smell of coffee was already brewing. He sat up, his bad leg protesting with a dull throb. The pallet on the floor was empty, the blanket folded neatly at the foot of his bed. He pulled on his boots and limped to the door. The sight that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. Magda was already outside, her back to him, by the water trough. Yesterday, it had been leaking, a steady drip, drip, drip into the thirsty ground. The wood warped and the fittings loose. Now, it was silent. He could see where she had used a hammer and some spare nails to refasten the boards, her work solid and true. As he watched, she moved from the trough to the barn. He followed, staying in the shadows of the cabin. He peered inside. She was in the stall with old Samson. One of the boards on the stall door had been splintered for months, a hazard he'd meant to fix but never had. Magda had found a spare plank, and with his saw and hammer, she was fitting a new, sturdy replacement. Old Samson, who was often skittish around strangers, stood perfectly still, nuzzling her shoulder occasionally as if she'd been his caretaker for years. It was then that he heard the sound of an approaching wagon. It was the Beasley family. Their small farm a few miles down the road, Martha Beasley, a sharp-nosed woman with a mouth perpetually pursed in disapproval, pulled her wagon to a halt. Her 2 young sons gawked from the back. "Morning, Boone," she called out, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Her eyes, however, were fixed on Magda's broad back as she worked in the barn. "I see you've got yourself some help." Boone merely nodded, his hand resting on the doorframe. "Quite a specimen, ain't she?" Martha continued, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial, carrying whisper meant for him but loud enough for anyone to hear. "Lord have mercy, it's like watching a barrel try to live in a stick house." Her sons snickered. A white-hot spike of fury shot through Boone's gut. He took a step forward, his hand clenching into a fist, a harsh retort on his lips. But he stopped. He looked at Magda. She hadn't seemed to hear, or if she had, she gave no sign. Her movements didn't falter. The hammer continued to fall with steady, even strokes, each blow driving a nail deeper into the wood, securing the broken pieces of his world. She was oblivious, or perhaps, he thought, simply indifferent to the cruel words of small-minded people. He let the anger go, the fight draining out of him as quickly as it had come. He had no right to defend her. Not yet. He was just the man who owned the stickhouse. The days settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the endless list of chores the ranch demanded. They worked, for the most part, in a comfortable silence. 2 solitary planets now circling the same star of survival. They rarely spoke of anything beyond the immediate and the practical, the depth of the well, the price of feed in town, the way the wind from the south usually brought rain. Their pasts remained uncharted territories, vast and shadowed countries they tacitly agreed not to enter. It was Magda who offered the first passport. They were sitting by the fire one evening, the desert night having finally chased the blistering heat of the day. Boone was oiling a rifle. The metallic clicked sharp in the quiet cabin. Magda was darning one of his work shirts, her large hands surprisingly nimble with the needle, her head bent over her task, the firelight catching the pale gold of her braids. "You have no family, Mr. Coulter?" she asked, her voice soft, not looking up from her work. The question startled him. No one had asked him that in years. "Just a father I barely knew," he answered, his voice gruff. "He's buried out past the barn. My mother died when I was a boy. No one else." She nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense to her. "It is a hard thing to be alone." She finished a stitch and looked into the flames. "Where I grew up, you were never alone. There was always the family, the village, the ice." "The ice?" "In my homeland," she said, a distant look in her blue eyes. "The world is made of ice and stone for half the year. The wind bites, and the sun is a stranger. To survive, you must huddle together." A sad, faint smile touched her lips. "But there is a coldness that has nothing to do with the weather." She told him of her childhood then, her voice a low, steady murmur against the crackle of the fire. She spoke of a stern, unyielding father who saw the world in terms of its practical uses. The land was for crops, the animals were for slaughter, and his daughters were for marriage. "He was not a cruel man," she explained, a strange note of apology in her tone. "He was a hard man, made by a hard land. He taught me to work, to endure. He would say, 'A woman is a vessel. Magda, her hands are for labor and her body is for children. Her purpose is to be filled.' He believed he was giving me the only wisdom that mattered." Boone stopped his work, the oily rag still in his hand. He pictured a young Magda, already taller than the other girls, being handed this cold, hard truth as her only inheritance. He saw how it had shaped her, forging her incredible self-reliance while starving something essential within her. She was not just a strong woman. She was a woman who had been taught that her strength was her only worth. "He married me to Anders when I was 17, she continued, her gaze still fixed on the fire. "Anders was a good farmer, a righteous man. He had the largest farm in the county. My father was very proud." She fell silent, the needle still in her hand. The silence was heavier than before, filled with the things she wasn't saying. Boone didn't push. He knew a haunted look when he saw one. He lived with one in the mirror every morning. A few nights later, the roles were reversed. She saw him staring into the fire, his jaw tight, his eyes 1,000 miles away. He'd woken from a nightmare, the phantom screams of dying men still echoing in his ears. "The war," she stated. It wasn't a question. He flinched, then gave a curt nod. "Your leg," she said softly. "Apache," he said, the word like a stone in his mouth. "Ambush in a dry wash. They were waiting for us. We rode straight into it." He didn't want to talk about it, but her quiet, expectant presence seemed to pull the words from him. He found himself telling her not of the battle, but of the aftermath, of a young private named Miller, his face pale with fear, pinned down by arrow fire. "He was just a boy, cried for his mother," Boone said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. I went back for him, dragged him behind a rock. That's when I took the arrow in my leg. Got him out, though. He was grateful." "This boy?" Magda asked. A bitter, humorless smile twisted Boone's lips. "He was dead. Took a stray bullet while I was pulling him. Died right there in my arms, still calling for his mother." He paused, the memory raw and fresh. "The army called it brave. Gave me a citation." He looked at his own hands, as if seeing the boy's blood on them. Felt more like a fool's errand. He then told her of the hospital, a place he hated more than the battlefield. He spoke of the 3 months he spent lying on a cot, staring at a water-stained ceiling. He described the endless procession of doctors and orderlies who saw him not as a man, but as a collection of wounds to be prodded and measured. "No one came," he said, the admission costing him more than he would have thought. Not a single soul. My father was already dead by then. No other kin to speak of. The men from my company were either dead or shipped out to another territory. I just lay there, listened to the other men groan and die. 3 months. Not one visitor. Magda looked at him, her blue eyes filled with a profound, aching understanding. She had been trapped in the cold of her father's house. He had been trapped in the sterile loneliness of that infirmary. Both of them had learned the same lesson in different lands, that pain was a private country, and you were its sole inhabitant. In that moment, something shifted. They were no longer just a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were two survivors, sharing a map of their scars in the quiet intimacy of the cabin. The next week, they began rebuilding the long stretch of fence on the western pasture. It was brutal work under the relentless sun. The ground was hard as iron, and digging the post holes was a jarring, exhausting task. Boone's leg ached with a fiery intensity, and sweat poured from him, stinging his eyes. They worked side by side, a silent team. He would dig the holes, and Magda, with her incredible strength, would carry the heavy timber posts and set them in place. Late in the afternoon, as he was using a heavy iron bar to break up a section of rock-hard caliche, his bad leg buckled without warning. It simply gave way. He cried out, a sharp curse of frustration, as he tumbled backward, landing hard in the dust. A searing pain shot from his hip down to his ankle. He lay there, stunned and furious, the dust thick in his mouth. He felt a surge of pure, white-hot humiliation. To be so weak, so broken, in front of her. He heard her approach, saw her large boot stop beside him. He braced himself for a comment, for pity, for anything but the helpless shame he was feeling. Instead, she simply bent down. Before he could protest, she had slid one powerful arm under his shoulders and another under his knees. "I am all right," he growled, trying to push himself up. "Be still," she commanded, her voice calm and firm. And then, with an ease that defied belief, she lifted him. He weighed nearly 180 pounds, yet she straightened up as if he were a sack of grain, holding him securely in her arms. He was too shocked to speak. He was cradled against her strong chest, his head near her shoulder. He could smell the sun and dust on her skin, a clean, earthy scent. He looked up at her face. She was looking down at him, a concerned frown on her brow. Then, the absurdity of the situation struck him. Him, the hardened soldier, being carried like a bride by his own giantess of a wife. A rough, dry chuckle escaped his throat. Magda looked down, surprised. "What is it?" "Nothing," he gasped, the chuckle growing into a genuine laugh, a sound so unfamiliar it felt like it belonged to another man. "Just thank you." A slow smile spread across her face, the warm, genuine one that made her eyes shine. She smiled down at him, and in that moment, he saw the humor too. She laughed with him, a low, rich sound that seemed to chase away some of the harshness of the desert. She carried him to the shade of a lone mesquite tree and set him down gently. The laughter subsided, but they continued to look at each other. For the first time, it wasn't a wary, assessing glance. He saw past her sighs to the deep well of kindness in her eyes. She saw past his scars and his limp to the man hiding behind them. It was a long, silent moment of pure, unvarnished recognition. That evening, the intimacy of that moment lingered in the small cabin. After their meal, as Boone sat staring at the fire, Magda approached him, a basin of warm water in one hand and a straight razor in the other. He hadn't shaved in over a week, and a rough, dark stubble covered his jaw. "That must itch," she said softly. "Let me—" He hesitated. To let someone that close, with a blade to his throat, was an act of profound trust. He looked up at her calm, steady face, and gave a slow nod. He sat on a stool while she wrapped a warm, damp cloth around his lower face. The heat was a shock, a soothing comfort that seemed to seep into his bones. He closed his eyes. He could feel her presence in front of him, could hear the soft swish of the razor being stropped against a piece of leather. When she removed the cloth, he opened his eyes. She was so close. He could see the faint dusting of freckles across her nose, the tiny white line of the scar through her eyebrow. She lathered his face with soap, her fingers surprisingly gentle against his rough skin. Then, she tilted his head back, one hand firm and warm on his shoulder, and began to shave. The cabin was utterly silent save for the faint, wet scrape of the blade against his skin. Her movements were slow, confident, and incredibly precise. He didn't feel a single pull or nick. He watched her eyes, saw their intense concentration. A trembling silence stretched between them, thick with a tension that was entirely new. It wasn't awkwardness. It was a fragile, terrifying awareness. When she finished, she wiped the last of the soap from his face with the cloth. Her fingers lingered on his jaw, her thumb deliberately, tenderly, brushed against the thin, puckered scar on his left cheek. A souvenir from a knife fight in a border town saloon years ago. The touch was like a brand. It sent a tremor straight through him. His hand shot up and caught hers, pressing her palm flat against his cheek. He held it there, his eyes locked on hers. He could feel the calluses on her palm, the strength in her fingers. He kept her hand there, holding it longer than was necessary, longer than was proper. Slowly, inevitably, he began to lean forward. He saw her eyes widen slightly, her lips part. She didn't pull away. She leaned in to meet him. Their faces were inches apart. He could feel her breath, warm and sweet, on his lips. The kiss was a moment away, a promise hanging in the charged air. And then he stopped. The ghosts came rushing back, the face of the dying private, the cold, empty hospital room, the jeering laughter of the Tuckers, asterisk broken, damaged, a cripple. What right did he have to touch this woman? What did he have to offer her but a life of hardship on a failing ranch, shackled to a half-man haunted by the dead? He felt a crushing wave of unworthiness wash over him. He pulled back abruptly, dropping her hand as if it had burned him. He stood up, turning away from her so she couldn't see the torment on his face. "Thank you," he mumbled, his voice a choked whisper. I need some air." He grabbed his walking stick and fled the cabin, limping out into the cold desert night. Magda stood frozen for a long moment, her hand still tingling where he had held it. The warmth of the near kiss was still on her lips. She looked at the basin of water, the razor, the small space where he had just been, with a quiet, dignified grace. She cleaned everything, putting it all back in its proper place. Her movements were controlled, her face a mask of calm composure. Then, she walked to the door and stepped outside. She didn't follow him. She stood on the other side of the cabin, cloaked in the shadows, and looked up at the indifferent moon. The desert wind was cold, and she wrapped her arms around herself. And then, for the first time since she had arrived in this desolate land, Magda wept. Silent tears streamed down her face. Tears not of anger or humiliation, but of a strange, new, and exquisitely painful hope being crushed. All her life, her strength had been used, commanded, taken for granted. Tonight, in that cabin, she had felt for the first time that someone had not just seen her strength, but had seen her asterisk. She had felt, for the first time, the powerful, terrifying desire to be needed not just for what her hands could do, but for what her heart could offer. And he had turned away. The brittle silence that followed the night of the almost kiss was a new and difficult thing. It was not the comfortable quiet of two solitary people working in tandem, nor was it the awkward hush of strangers. It was a silence made of splintered glass, sharp and dangerous to navigate. They moved around it, and around each other, with a careful, deliberate distance. Boone felt her withdrawal as a physical presence, a wall she had rebuilt, brick by silent brick. His own shame was a bitter taste in his mouth, a constant reminder of his cowardice. He had fled from the one moment of genuine warmth he had been offered in years, and he didn't know how to find his way back. The town of Redemption did not care for their fragile peace. News, especially of the unusual, traveled faster than a prairie fire in that sparse country. The arrival of Boone Coulter's mail-order bride, the giantess from Nebraska, was the most interesting event since the last public hanging. The whispers started in the saloon, were embellished in the general store, and finally became accepted fact over the sewing circles in the church hall. "Heard Coulter's got himself an ogress out at that broken-down ranch," one man would say over a warm beer. "Saw her myself," another would add, embellishing the truth for a better story. "Taller than his horse and twice as wide. Looks like she could pull a plow herself." The talk among the women was crueler, sharper. "What does a man like that want with a woman of that size?" they'd whisper, their words laced with a morbid curiosity. "It ain't natural." The rumor solidified into a simple, ugly phrase that was passed around like a soiled coin. Boone Coulter had married a monster. Magda was not deaf. She felt the change in the air when they had to ride into town for supplies a week later. She felt the stares, no longer just curious, but now laced with a mixture of fear and derision. Children would stop their games in the dusty street to point. Women would hurry their skirts aside as she passed, as if her presence were a contagion. She walked with her head held high, her back ramrod straight, her face a stoic mask. But Boone, walking beside her, could see the infinitesimal tightening of her jaw, the way her hands were clenched into tight fists at her sides. The confrontation he had been dreading happened in Miller's general store. The place was the town's social hub, a cramped space that smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and gossip. Magda was examining a bolt of sturdy calico cloth when a voice, sharp and condescending, cut through the room. Well, if it isn't the happy new bride. It was Beatrice Tucker, Jedediah's wife. She was a thin, severe woman with eyes as small and hard as pebbles, and she was flanked by two other women who served as her loyal echo chamber. Magda turned slowly, her expression placid. "Good day, Mrs. Tucker." Beatrice's thin lips curled into a semblance of a smile. She let her eyes travel up and down Magda's formidable frame in a deliberately insulting appraisal. "I must say, Mrs. Coulter, your constitution is the talk of the town. My Jedediah says Boone must have ordered a wife by the pound." The other women tittered. Magda's face remained impassive. She simply turned back to the cloth. Her dismissal seemed to infuriate Beatrice more than any angry retort could have. "Don't you turn your back on me, girl," she snapped. "We have standards in this town. We are God-fearing folk. A union should be fruitful, blessed by the Lord." She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous, carrying whisper. "Tell me, what kind of fruit could possibly come from a tree like you, a body like that? It was made for labor, not for love. It's a barren field. I'd wager Boone Coulter will get no sons from you." The word hung in the air, ugly and final. Asterisk, barren asterisk. It was the ultimate condemnation for a woman in their world, a curse that branded her as incomplete, a failure. The store fell silent. Everyone was watching. Magda did not flinch. She carefully folded the bolt of calico and placed it back on the shelf. Then she turned to face Beatrice Tucker, and for the first time, Boone saw a flicker of something arctic and dangerous in the depths of her blue eyes. But her voice, when she spoke, was perfectly even. "My womb is between myself, my husband, and God, Mrs. Tucker. It is not a topic for public speculation." She paused, her gaze steady. "Now, if you will excuse me, I have provisions to purchase." She moved past them, a great ship sailing through a flock of squawking gulls, and continued her shopping as if nothing had happened. Boone, who had been standing by the counter, felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost choked him. immediately followed by a wave of murderous rage directed at the sneering face of Beatrice Tucker. He didn't hear about the incident until they were on their way back to the ranch. He had been settling the account with Mr. Miller while the women had gathered, and had only seen the aftermath. "What did she say to you?" he asked, his voice tight, noticing the rigid set of Magda's shoulders. Magda stared straight ahead at the dusty horizon. It was nothing, the idle chatter of unhappy women. "Magda, what did she say?" She was silent for a long moment. Then, in a low, flat voice, she told him. Boone pulled the wagon to a sudden, jarring halt. The rage he'd felt in the store came roaring back, blinding and absolute. Without a word, he turned the wagon around, whipping the reins so hard that old Samson whinnied in protest. "What are you doing?" Magda demanded, grabbing his arm. "I'm going back," he snarled, his face a dark mask of fury. "Caleb Tucker is likely at the saloon. I'm going to teach that whelp a lesson about his mother's mouth." "No," she said, her grip on his arm surprisingly strong. "Stop. You will do no such thing." "The hell I won't. No one talks to my wife that way. No one—" The words were out of his mouth before he'd even realized he'd thought them. Asterisk, my wife. "And what will you accomplish?" she countered, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through his red haze of anger. "You will get into a brawl, a man with a bad leg against that young bull. You will be beaten or arrested. You will give them exactly what they want. They wish to see you brought low. Boone, do not help them." "I have to do asterisk something asterisk," he insisted, his voice raw. "You will do nothing," she commanded, her eyes boring into his. "You will not fight for me. Not like that. I have been enduring the whispers of fools my entire life. I can endure this." He stared at her, at the fierce pride and unyielding strength in her face. He saw the wisdom in her words, but it did nothing to cool the fire in his blood. Reluctantly, his hands still clenched into white-knuckled fists, he turned the wagon back toward home. That night, the silence in the cabin was heavier than ever. Magda prepared their dinner with a quiet, ferocious efficiency. She said nothing about what had happened, and neither did he, but the unspoken words were a chasm between them. He had wanted to defend her, and she had forbidden it. He felt unmanned, and he sensed that her own formidable control was stretched to its breaking point. He went to bed early, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay in the darkness, listening to the wind, his mind replaying the ugly scene in the store, the sneer on Beatrice Tucker's face. Hours passed. He must have drifted off, because he woke with a start to a faint clink of glass. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint, demonic glow. In the shadows near the hearth, Magda was sitting on the floor, her back against the cold stone. In her hand was his bottle of whiskey. She wasn't drinking from a cup. She had the bottle tilted to her lips, and she took a long, slow swallow. He lay perfectly still, watching her. Her composure had finally cracked. He could see the tension in the line of her back, the way her shoulders were hunched as if against a blow. She was a fortress, and he was watching it crumble from the inside out. He had never felt so helpless. Finally, he couldn't bear the silence any longer. He swung his legs out of the bed, the rope frame groaning in protest. She looked up, startled, as he limped toward the hearth. Her eyes, in the dim light, were blurred and unfocused, shadowed with a pain she had refused to show all day. She didn't try to hide the bottle. He stood before her, a dark silhouette against the dying embers. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt pathetic and useless. She stared up at him, her gaze raw and vulnerable. The whiskey had stripped away her defenses, leaving only the bare, aching truth. "Tell me," she whispered, her voice thick and raspy, "am I so monstrous?" She looked down at her own large hands, at the expanse of her lap. "Does it disgust you to be tied to a woman so oversized?" The question was a blade, and it went straight into his heart. It was the same insecurity he had fled from, the same fear he had seen in his own reflection. He saw her whole life in that question, her father's cold pronouncements, her first husband's loveless utility, Beatrice Tucker's venomous words. All of it had been designed to make her feel like less of a woman, and she was finally asking him if it was true. He could have given her 1,000 reassurances. He could have told her she was strong and capable, that her eyes were the color of a mountain lake, that her quiet presence had become the anchor of his world. But words were clumsy, inadequate things. They were the tools of cowards. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and took the whiskey bottle from her unresisting hand, setting it on the floor. Then he knelt in front of her, his bad leg protesting. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her tear-streaked cheeks. He looked into her eyes, trying to pour every ounce of his own broken, wordless feelings into that one gaze. And then he leaned forward and kissed her. It was a clumsy, hesitant first kiss. Her lips were cold and tasted of whiskey and salt. He was trembling, a fine, uncontrollable shudder that ran through his entire body. This was not a kiss of passion, but of apology, of recognition, of a desperate, shared loneliness. It was the only answer he had to give. For a moment, she was perfectly still, a statue of surprise. Then, with a soft, broken sound deep in her throat, she kissed him back. The kiss deepened, the initial hesitancy melting away, replaced by something fierce and hungry. It was a kiss that had been waiting for years, a kiss that spoke of cold nights and silent meals and unspoken sorrows. It wasn't enough. The kiss broke, and they were staring at each other in the gloom, breathing hard. And then the dam of restraint that had held them both in check for weeks burst apart. He pulled her to her feet, or rather, she rose with him, her strength enveloping him. They came together in a tangle of limbs, a collision of desperate needs. It was awkward and frantic, a desperate search for closeness. His hands were in her hair, pulling the pins from her braids, letting the heavy blonde waves tumble down her back. Her hands were on his face, his shoulders, pulling him tight against her, her strength a wonder and a comfort. He had expected to feel small in her embrace, but he didn't. He felt anchored. He felt, for the first time in a very long time, like a man. He lifted her, though it was more of a mutual, clumsy effort, and carried her the few feet to his narrow bed. The word "mall" was a distant, meaningless echo. In the darkness, there was no monster, no cripple. There were only two people, starved for a touch that was not born of duty or violence. It was a raw and honest coming together, a clumsy, urgent exploration. He discovered that her skin was softer than he could have imagined, that her strength was a source of incredible passion. And in her arms, Boone Coulter finally understood the depth of his own need. It wasn't about a pair of hands to help with the chores. It was a need for her asterisk, for the quiet resilience that had taken root in the barren soil of his life. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, the threadbare blanket pulled over them. Her long limbs were wrapped around him, her head resting on his chest. He could feel the steady, slow beat of her heart against his ear. The silence returned, but this time it was a different kind. It was a silence of peace, of completion. He held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, and felt the tight, hard knot of loneliness that he had carried inside him for 7 years finally begin to dissolve. For the first time since he'd woken up in that army hospital, Boone Coulter fell asleep without the shadow of a nightmare. And he did not dream at all. The days that followed were forged from a new and startling element: peace. The raw, desperate passion of that first night had cooled into a steady, quiet warmth that settled over the small cabin like a much-needed blanket. For Boone, waking up was no longer a grim return to consciousness, but a slow surfacing into the comforting reality of Magda's presence beside him. He would wake in the pre-dawn gray to find her already stirring, her long frame a warm and solid line against his back. The nightmares did not return. The ghosts of the dry wash seemed, for now, to have been banished by the simple, profound fact of her existence. Together, they declared war on the decay that had claimed the ranch. They moved as a single unit, their shared purpose and unspoken language between them. Boone, with his knowledge of the land, showed Magda where the soil was least rocky, and together they tilled a small patch of earth for a vegetable garden. He watched in amazement as she worked, her strength turning the stubborn, unforgiving ground with a steady power his own body could no longer muster. She seemed to coax life from the dust, her large hands planting seeds with a tender concentration, as if whispering secrets to them. They repaired the cabin roof, Boone climbing the ladder with a newfound confidence, Magda below him, a steadying presence, passing up shingles and handing him the hammer. He found himself talking more than he had in years, explaining the quirks of the house, the way the wood groaned in the heat, the history of the land. She, in turn, spoke of her homeland, of the different kinds of snow, of the way the sun looked in the land of the midnight sun. They were filling in the vast, empty spaces of their pasts, not with the grand, painful histories, but with the small, simple details that make up a life. The chill of the desert night was no longer a threat, but an invitation to huddle closer to the hearth. Magda, it turned out, was a master of making something from almost nothing. She baked a dense, flavorful bread using the last of their flour, and made stews that filled the cabin with an aroma so rich and comforting it felt like a prayer. They were not just surviving anymore. They were building a life, a small, defiant bastion of warmth against the vast, cold indifference of the wilderness. One afternoon, Boone decided it was time Magda learned to ride. Old Samson was too lame for anything but pulling the buckboard. But Boone had recently traded for a neighbor's mare, a skittish but sturdy little horse named Daisy. "Every person in this country needs to know how to sit a horse," he declared, leading the mare into the corral. Magda looked from the horse to the saddle with a dubious expression. "On the farm in Nebraska, the horses pulled the plows. I did not ride them." "It's different," he said, a rare smile touching his lips. "Come on, I'll show you." The lesson was a study in contrasts. Magda, so graceful and powerful on her own 2 feet, was at first clumsy and awkward in the saddle. She was too tall, her legs too long for the stirrups. But she was fearless. Boone stood in the center of the corral, holding the lead rope, his voice calm and steady as he gave her instructions. He watched as her initial stiffness gave way to a dawning understanding. She learned to move with the horse, not against it, her innate strength translating into a natural, powerful seat. Within an hour, she was trotting Daisy around the corral on her own, a look of pure, unadulterated joy on her face. Her laughter, rich and free, echoed in the dry air, and Boone felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the sun. A few days later, she returned the favor. The old wood-burning stove in the cabin had a crack in its iron flank, a wound that bled smoke and heat. Boone had been stuffing it with clay for years, a temporary fix that never lasted. "This is no good," Magda said one morning, examining the crack with a critical eye. "It wastes wood, and one day it will break for good." She had seen a broken soldering iron and some flux in his tool chest. That afternoon, she meticulously cleaned the cracked iron and, with a focus and skill that stunned him, she taught him how to heat the iron in the forge and carefully weld the crack shut. Her father, she explained, had taught her to mend tools because it was cheaper than buying new ones. Boone, who had always prided himself on his practical skills, watched her, humbled and impressed. Her hands, which could be so gentle, were steady and sure as they worked with the hot metal. They were 2 halves of a whole, where he was broken. She was strong, where she was untutored in the ways of this harsh land. He was the expert. They fit together, their strengths and weaknesses complementing each other, like 2 pieces of a puzzle that had finally found their match. In the evenings, They would sit on the porch and watch the sky bleed from orange to purple, not always talking, but simply existing together, the silence now a comfortable, shared blanket, Boone thought, with a sense of wonder that this must be what happiness felt like. The peace was shattered on a Tuesday. The sky was a vast, cloudless blue, and a dry wind whispered through the sparse grass. Boone was reinforcing a corral post when he saw the rider approaching. He wasn't a cowboy or a prospector. He was dressed in a dark, city-style suit and a bowler hat that looked wildly out of place in the Arizona sun. He rode a well-groomed bay, not a working ranch horse, and he sat his saddle with the stiff posture of a man unaccustomed to it. Boone watched him approach, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. Strangers were rarely a good sign in this part of the country. He leaned on his shovel, his hand instinctively close to the Colt revolver that was always on his hip. Magda came to the cabin door, wiping her hands on her apron, her face shaded by the porch roof. The man reined in his horse a respectful distance from the cabin. He was middle-aged, with a neat, graying mustache and cool, intelligent gray eyes that took in everything: the mended roof, the new garden, Boone's bad leg, and Magda standing in the doorway, with a single, sweeping glance. "Mr. Boone Coulter?" he asked, his voice polite, businesslike. "Who's asking?" Boone replied, his tone hard. The man dismounted with a slight grimace, clearly saddle-sore. He took a leather card case from his inner coat pocket. "My name is Silas Hedges. I'm a private investigator out of Omaha." An investigator? The knot in Boone's stomach tightened into a cold, hard stone. He glanced at Magda. Her face had become a perfect, unreadable mask, but he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, a deep, familiar apprehension. "Don't have any business with investigators," Boone said. "My business is not with you, sir, not directly," Hedges said, his gaze flicking toward Magda. "It concerns your wife, Mrs. Coulter, formerly Mrs. Magda Sorensen." "Her name is Mrs. Coulter," Boone said, his voice dangerously low. "Whatever business you have with her, you can say in front of me." Hedges gave a sigh, as if dealing with a difficult child. "Very well, but perhaps it would be more discreet if we spoke in private. My employers would prefer it." "Who are your employers?" Boone demanded. "The Kincaid family of Nebraska," Hedges said. The name meant nothing to Boone, but he saw Magda's shoulders stiffen almost imperceptibly. "I have nothing to say to the Kincaids," Magda said, her voice clear and cold, ringing out from the porch. Hedges ignored her, keeping his focus entirely on Boone. "Mr. Coulter, the Kincaids are a very prominent, very wealthy family. Their son, Anders Kincaid, was your wife's first husband. I have been hired to ascertain her whereabouts and to look into the circumstances of her departure from their community." "Her husband is dead. She is a widow. That's all the circumstance I need to know," Boone said, taking a half-step forward. "Is it?" Hedges asked, his voice silky smooth. He finally looked Boone directly in the eye. "Sir, I am not the law. I am just a man paid to gather facts. And the facts are these. A little over a year ago, Anders Kincaid was found dead in his own barn. The cause of death was a crushed skull, the result of a heavy, poorly stacked woodpile falling on top of him. It was ruled an accident." Boone said nothing, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. "The night of the accident," Hedges continued, his voice a low, confidential murmur. "Several neighbors heard a loud argument coming from the Kincaid farmhouse, a shouting match between Anders and his wife. Your wife, Mr. Coulter. The next morning, Anders was found dead, and within a week, Mrs. Sorensen had sold what little she could and disappeared without a word to his family. She traveled under her maiden name and made her way here. The Kincaids find these facts troubling. They believe the accident may have been no accident at all. The world seemed to tilt under Boone's feet. The clear, bright day suddenly felt cold and menacing. He looked from Hedges's calm, professional face to Magda, who stood frozen in the doorway, her face pale as bone. "That's a damn lie," Boone growled, but the words felt hollow even to his own ears. "Is it?" Hedges repeated. "I make no accusations. Mr. Coulter, I am merely presenting the information my employers have paid me to find. They are considering petitioning the local authorities to have the case re-examined. They feel justice was not served." He reached into his coat again and produced an envelope. "This is my card, and a summary of my findings. Read it at your leisure. My employers simply want the truth. I will be staying in the town of Redemption for a few days, should you wish to discuss this further." Without another word, he tipped his bowler hat, climbed stiffly back onto his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick, poisonous silence in his wake. Boone stood there for a long time, the envelope feeling like a lead weight in his hand. He didn't look at Magda. He couldn't. He finally turned and limped toward the barn. The need to be alone, a burning, physical imperative. He could feel her eyes on his back, but she didn't call out to him. Inside the cool, hay-scented dimness of the barn, he tore open the envelope. It was just as Hedges had said, a neatly typed report detailing the events, the argument, the discovery of the body, the specific nature of the injuries, Magda's hasty departure. It was all there, cold, factual, and damning. His first instinct was a roaring denial. This was a lie, a fabrication by a rich, powerful family to slander a woman who had escaped their grasp. He thought of Magda's quiet kindness, the joy on her face when she rode the horse, the gentle way she tended their small garden. It was impossible. She was not a killer. But then, the poison began to work. He was a man who had seen the darkest parts of human nature. He had seen good men do terrible things in the heat of a moment, and a cold, insidious voice started whispering in the back of his mind. Asterisk. A loud argument. He thought of her towering height, her incredible, almost unnatural strength, the strength he had admired, the strength that had lifted him as if he were a child. What if that strength had been turned to anger? Asterisk. A crushed skull. He looked at his own hands, then pictured hers, so large and capable. Capable of what? Asterisk, she disappeared. Why had she never told him? She had spoken of her unhappy marriage, but she had never mentioned how it ended. It was a deliberate omission, a secret. He spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze, mending things that weren't broken, his mind a battlefield of trust and suspicion. When he finally returned to the cabin at dusk, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. Magda had prepared dinner, but she didn't speak. She moved around the small space with a guarded, wounded stillness. They ate in a silence that was a cruel echo of their first meal together. But this was not the silence of strangers. It was the silence of a deep, vital trust being broken. Boone found himself watching her, his gaze clinical and assessing. He looked at her hands as she lifted a piece of bread, and the image of a falling woodpile flashed in his mind. He looked at her face, her beautiful, strong face, and wondered what secrets were hiding behind those clear blue eyes. The warmth was gone, the easy companionship, the shared laughter, the comfortable peace. It had all evaporated, stolen by a man in a bowler hat. After the meal, she went outside to sit on the porch, wrapping her arms around herself as if she were cold. Though the evening was mild, Boone stayed inside, staring at the wall, the investigator's report a burning brand in his mind. The doubt, once planted, had taken root, and he had a sick feeling it was already beginning to strangle everything good they had built. The peace was a fragile, thin sheet of ice, and Silas Hedges's visit had shattered it completely. In the days that followed, a cold and silent distance grew between Boone and Magda, a chasm of unspoken words and averted gazes. They still worked together, their bodies moving through the familiar rhythms of ranch life. But the easy intimacy was gone. When their hands accidentally brushed as they passed a tool, They both recoiled as if from a static charge. The cabin, once a sanctuary of shared warmth, now felt cramped and suffocating, each of them retreating to their own side of the room, their own side of the silence. Magda felt the change in him like a shift in the barometric pressure, a coming storm. The open, unguarded way he had begun to look at her was gone, replaced by a guarded, assessing stare. She would catch him directing at her when he thought she wasn't looking. It was the look of a man trying to solve a puzzle that she herself was the key to. She saw the doubt in his eyes, a flicker of suspicion that was more painful than any insult Beatrice Tucker could have hurled at her. She tried, in her own direct, practical way, to breach the wall he had erected. One morning, as he was preparing to ride out and check the fence line, she stood in the doorway, blocking his path. "Boone," she began, her voice quiet but firm. "We do not speak." He stopped, his hand on the doorframe, his gaze fixed on some point over her shoulder. "There's work to be done. We're speaking now." "No," she insisted, a hint of desperation coloring her tone. "This is not speaking. This is noise. Something is wrong. It has been wrong since that man came, the investigator." She took a breath, her blue eyes pleading with him. "If you have a question, ask it. If you have a fear, name it. This silence, it is a poison." He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her heart ache. He was a man at war with himself. His face was a mask of torment, his jaw tight, his eyes shadowed with a conflict he refused to share. He looked at her, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the man who had trembled when he kissed her, the man who had held her through the night as if she were a lifeline. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a grim, stubborn resolve. "There's nothing to say," he said, his voice flat and hard. "I've got fences to check." He pushed past her, not roughly, but with a finality that was just as brutal, and limped out into the unforgiving sunlight, leaving her alone in the suffocating quiet of the cabin. That evening, she decided she would make one last attempt. She would not let the poison of silence kill the fragile thing that had grown between them. She spent the afternoon preparing a special meal, a stew richer than their usual fare, made with the last of their smoked meat and the tender new vegetables from her garden. She baked a fresh loaf of bread, and the warm, yeasty smell filled the cabin, a scent of home and hearth, a desperate invocation of the peace they had lost. As the sun began to set, casting long, skeletal shadows across the land, she set the table, she lit the lamp, its golden glow a small, defiant beacon in the growing twilight. She waited. The sun disappeared completely, and the sky turned from a bruised purple to a deep, star-dusted black. The stew grew cold on the stove. The bread sat, untouched, on its board. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the empty chair where he should have been sitting. Magda sat at the table in the deepening gloom, her hands folded in her lap, her posture ramrod straight. She did not eat. She simply waited, a statue of vigil in the lonely cabin. Every gust of wind, every skittering sound of a desert creature, made her heart leap with a hope that was immediately crushed. Her worry was a cold, physical thing, a knot of ice in her stomach. It wasn't just that he was late. It was the reason he was late. She knew, with a certainty that was as bleak as the night outside, that he had not stayed away because he was injured or lost. He had stayed away because he could not bear to be with her. The hours crawled by. The lamp burned low, its flame sputtering. Finally, she blew it out, plunging the cabin into a darkness broken only by the faint, silver light of the moon through the grimy window. She did not go to bed. She sat in his chair, wrapped in a blanket, and stared into the darkness, her vigil now one not of hope, but of a grim, sorrowful resignation. Boone hadn't intended to stay away. When he'd ridden out that morning, Magda's words echoing in his head, he had been suffocating under the weight of his doubt. Asterisk. If you have a question, ask it. But how could he ask? How could he look at the woman he had held in his arms and say, "Asterisk, did you kill your husband?" The words themselves felt like a betrayal. He rode not to the fence line, but to town. He told himself he was just going for supplies, but it was a lie. He was a moth drawn to a flame, a man seeking out the very thing that would burn him. He was looking for Silas Hedges. He found him in the Red Dog Saloon, sitting alone at a corner table, nursing a whiskey. The investigator looked up as Boone approached, his expression calm and unsurprised. "Mr. Coulter," Hedges said, gesturing to the empty chair. "I had a feeling I'd be seeing you again." Boone ignored the chair, remaining standing. "The things you said, the things in that report, is it all true?" "Every word is taken from sworn witness statements or the official coroner's report," Hedges said smoothly. "As I told you, I deal in facts." "Facts can lie," Boone rasped. "They can be misinterpreted, certainly," Hedges conceded. "But a violent argument followed by a convenient accident and a hasty departure, most people would call that a suspicious pattern." It was at that moment that a new voice, laced with malice and glee, joined the conversation. "Well now, listen to this. The great war hero Boone Coulter, asking a stranger about his own wife." Boone turned. Caleb Tucker stood behind him, a cruel smirk on his face. His father, Jedediah, was at the bar, watching the scene with cold, calculating eyes. "This is none of your business, Tucker," Boone snarled. "Oh, I think it is," Caleb said, sauntering closer. "It's the business of every decent citizen in this town when a man brings a murderess into our midst." The word hung in the smoky air, and the saloon went quiet. Everyone turned to watch. Boone felt the blood drain from his face. This was what he had feared, what he had tried to keep locked away on the ranch. The poison was loose. "You watch your mouth," Boone said, his hand dropping to his hip. "Or what, cripple?" Caleb sneered, his own hand hovering over his gun. "You gonna defend her, the giantess who crushed her last husband's skull when he looked at her sideways? That's what this gentleman here is saying, ain't it?" He looked to Hedges for confirmation. Hedges, ever the professional, simply took a slow sip of his whiskey. "I am merely reporting the concerns of my clients." "You see," Caleb said, turning back to the room, "the Kincaid family in Nebraska thinks she's a killer, and now she's living right here among us." Jedediah Tucker chose that moment to make his move. He pushed himself away from the bar and approached the table, his face a mask of false civic concern. "Now, son, let's not have any trouble. This is a matter for the law." He looked at Boone, his eyes glinting. "Sheriff Brody needs to know about this. If there's a shadow of a doubt about this woman's past, if she's a fugitive from justice, then she needs to be detained for the safety of the community." It was a trap, and Boone had walked right into it. He had come to town seeking clarity, and had instead handed the Tuckers the very weapon they needed to destroy him. His private doubt had become their public accusation. "You're twisting this," Boone said, his voice ragged. "Are we?" Jedediah said smoothly. "There's a professional investigator here with a report full of damning evidence. There's a woman with a history of violence, and there's a dead man. Seems to me the sheriff has a duty to investigate. In fact, I insist upon it." He turned and strode out of the saloon, Caleb following with a triumphant smirk, leaving Boone standing alone in a sea of suspicious, hostile faces. He knew what he should have done. He should have mounted his horse and ridden back to the ranch as fast as he could. He should have told Magda, warned her, stood with her. But he was paralyzed. The Tuckers had articulated his own darkest fears, giving them a voice and a terrible legitimacy. He stayed in the saloon, ordering a whiskey, then another, the liquor doing nothing to numb the turmoil in his soul. It was well after midnight when he finally rode out of town, his head thick with whiskey and self-loathing. The moon was high and cold, illuminating a world that seemed alien and menacing. As he crested the final rise, He saw that the cabin was dark. A profound sense of dread washed over him. He pushed the door open. The cabin was cold and silent. A plate of uneaten stew sat on the table, a ghostly testament to her weight. "Magda!" he called out, his voice hoarse. There was no answer. He lit a lamp, his hands shaking. The room was empty. Her shawl was gone from its peg by the door. On the floor near the hearth, he saw the scuff marks of several pairs of heavy boots. They hadn't been his. He knew. In a flash of sickening certainty, he knew what had happened. He ran out to the barn. Daisy, the mare, was gone. She had been taken. He rode old Samson back to town, pushing the lame horse mercilessly, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He didn't slow until he reached the sheriff's office, a small, squat building at the end of the street. A single lamp burned in the window. He burst through the door without knocking. Sheriff Brody, a weary-looking man with a drooping mustache, looked up from his paperwork, his expression grim. "Where is she?" Boone demanded, his voice cracking. "Now, Boone, calm yourself," the sheriff said, rising slowly from his chair. "Jedediah Tucker and Mr. Hedges paid me a visit. They presented evidence concerning information about your wife's past. I had no choice but to bring her in for questioning." "Questioning? She's in a cell, isn't she?" Brody sighed and nodded toward the back of the office. "She's in the back. She's safe." Boone pushed past him and went to the heavy wooden door that led to the two cells. He peered through the small, barred window in the door. The cell was dark and bare, furnished only with a single wooden cot. Magda was standing in the center of the cell, her back to him, staring out the tiny, barred window at the moonlit sky. Even in the gloom, her posture was proud and unbroken. "Magda," he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. She turned slowly. Her face, half hidden in shadow, was calm. There were no tears in her eyes, no trace of fear. There was only a profound, bottomless disappointment. She walked to the cell door, stopping just on the other side of the bars. They stood there, separated by a few inches of air and a wall of iron and wood, a perfect metaphor for the state of their union. "I was going to tell you," he began, the words tumbling out in a desperate, pathetic rush. "I didn't know what to believe. I went to town to find out. I never meant for this to happen." She listened, her expression unchanging. She let his excuses hang in the dead air of the jailhouse, then die. When he finally fell silent, she looked at him, her gaze so direct and clear that he felt it strip him bare. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was not loud. It was a quiet, devastating whisper that cut him deeper than any shout could have. "If you believe me, Boone," she said, "say nothing. Don't try to explain. Just believe." She paused, and her gaze held his. "But if you doubt, if there is even a small part of you that believes what they say, then don't come back." Boone did not go back to the ranch. To return to the cold, empty cabin would be to admit defeat, to accept the silence as a verdict. He spent the remainder of the night in the town's livery stable, the smell of hay and horse a poor substitute for the scent of wood smoke and Magda that had come to define his home. He sat on a bale of straw, the sheriff's words and Magda's ultimatum echoing in the cavern of his skull, a torturous, repeating chorus. Asterisk, if you doubt, then don't come back. Doubt was the only thing he had trusted for 7 years. Doubt was the armor that had protected him from the pain of a world that had taken everything. He had doubted the army that sent him into an ambush, doubted the doctors who saw him as a collection of broken parts, and doubted the very possibility of a life that was anything more than a grim march toward the grave. Doubt had been his companion, his shield. But as he sat there in the cold, listening to the soft sounds of sleeping horses, he saw that his shield was also his cage. His doubt hadn't kept him safe. It had kept him alone. It had made him flee from Magda's touch, and it had made him a pawn in the Tuckers' cruel game. It had put the one person who had ever looked at him without pity into a jail cell. He thought of her standing behind those bars, not weeping or pleading, but looking at him with that clear, unwavering gaze. She had faced down Beatrice Tucker's venom and the town's derision with a quiet dignity that bordered on the sublime. And he, the soldier, the survivor, had crumbled at the first whisper of suspicion. The shame was a physical thing, a sickness in his gut. Her words came back to him, not the ultimatum, but the plea from that morning. Asterisk, if you have a question, ask it. He had been a coward. He had let another man's facts poison him without seeking the truth for himself. He had judged her in silence, the gravest sin one lonely soul can commit against another. As the first pale, gray light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the stable walls, a decision hardened within him. He would not be a coward any longer. He would not let his past poison his future. He owed her the truth, and he would tear this town apart to find it. He bypassed the sheriff's office and went straight to the town's only hotel. Silas Hedges was just leaving, his carpetbag in hand. Settling his bill at the front desk, Boone cornered him before he could step outside. I'm not finished with you, Boone said, his voice low and hard. Hedges turned, a flicker of annoyance in his gray eyes. Mr. Coulter, my business here is concluded. I have presented my findings to the local authorities. As per my client's secondary instructions, I'm taking the morning train. You presented accusations, not findings. Boone countered, stepping closer, his limp forgotten in the intensity of his focus. You lit a fire and now you're going to walk away while it burns. My job is not to pass judgment, only to deliver information. Then deliver it all, Boone demanded. The coroner who examined the body. You mentioned a report. I want to see it. I want to know everything, not just the parts that suited the Kincaids and the Tuckers. Hedges hesitated, his professional detachment warring with a clear desire to be rid of the entire messy affair. He looked at Boone's face, at the desperate, unyielding resolve in his eyes, and seemed to make a decision. This is highly irregular, he said with a sigh, but I suspect you will not let it rest. The Kincaids are powerful, Mr. Coulter, but they are not always right. He opened his briefcase and took out a thin file of papers, a copy of his own report. The examining physician was a doctor, Elias Vance, a good man, from what I could gather. Getting on in years, he was the one who officially ruled it an accident. What did he say, exactly? Hedges found the page. Doctor, Vance's testimony was quite clear. Anders Kincaid, or Sorensen, as your wife would have known him, was a man known for his heavy drinking. The doctor noted a high level of alcohol in the deceased's blood. The woodpile in question was, in the doctor's own words, a precarious and foolishly constructed death trap. It was stacked too high, with no cross-bracing. On uneven ground, Kincaid had built it himself the week prior. Boone felt a flicker of hope, a tiny pinprick of light in the darkness. What about the argument? Doctor, Vance noted that while there were bruises on the body consistent with a fall and being crushed, there were no marks on his hands or face to indicate a physical struggle, no defensive wounds, no scratches, no broken knuckles. He concluded that Kincaid, in a state of inebriation, likely stumbled against the woodpile in the dark, bringing the entire thing down upon himself. The truth, it was so simple, so squalid, so utterly believable. Not a monstrous act of violence, but a pathetic, drunken accident. Then why did she run? Boone asked, the last piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Why didn't she stay and tell them that? Hedges looked at him with a glimmer of something that might have been sympathy. Mr. Coulter, you've met the Kincaid's kind before, in the form of the Tuckers. They are a family that owns their county. They believe they own the truth as well. Doctor, Vance's report was an inconvenience to them. They wanted a villain for their son's pathetic death, and his strange, oversized foreign wife was the perfect candidate. Your wife was a terrified widow in a town that had already judged her. She had no family, no money, no one to speak for her. What would you have done? Boone finally understood. He saw Magda, alone and grieving, facing the cold, accusatory eyes of a powerful family and a hostile town. He saw her fear, her desperation. Her flight wasn't an admission of guilt. It was an act of survival. He had his answer. He had the truth. Now, he had to make everyone else believe it. The hearing was a farce, a piece of frontier theater staged for the benefit of the Tuckers. It was held in the saloon, the only building in town large enough to hold the crowd that had gathered. Sheriff Brody sat uncomfortably behind a poker table, acting as magistrate. Jedediah Tucker stood beside him, a smug look of civic virtue on his face, while Silas Hedges, delayed from his train, sat in the corner, a reluctant witness. The room was packed with the citizens of redemption, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and open hostility. They brought Magda in, her hands unbound. She walked through the silent, staring crowd with her head held high, her gaze fixed forward. They sat her on a lone chair in the center of the room. When she saw Boone standing near the back, a flicker of surprise and something unreadable crossed her face before she composed herself again. Jedediah Tucker began, his voice booming with self-importance. He presented the case, painting a picture of Magda as a monstrous, unnatural woman who had taken advantage of their poor, unsuspecting neighbor, Boone Coulter. He read from Hedges' report, cherry-picking the most damning phrases: asterisk violent argument, hasty departure, suspicious circumstances. "This woman is a danger," Tucker thundered, pointing a thick finger at Magda. "She is a black widow who may well have killed once and, God forbid, could kill again, for the safety of our families, of our town. She must be held accountable." A murmur of agreement ran through the crowd. They were a mob, primed and ready for a verdict. "That's enough, Jedediah," Sheriff Brody said wearily. "Now, Mrs. Coulter, do you have anything to say for yourself?" Magda looked at the sea of hostile faces. She opened her mouth, then closed it. What could she say that they would possibly believe? "I have something to say." A voice cut through the room. All heads turned. Boone pushed his way through the crowd, his limp more pronounced than ever, but his back ramrod straight. He walked to the center of the room and stood beside Magda's chair. He did not look at her. He looked at Jedediah Tucker. "You've had your say, Tucker," Boone said, his voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room. "Now I'll have mine. You've been trying to get my land for years. This was never about justice. This was about driving me out, and you used her to do it." "That's a slanderous accusation," Tucker blustered. "Is it?" Boone countered. "You talk about facts. Let's talk about all of them." He pulled the copy of the report from his coat pocket. "You talk about an argument, but you fail to mention that the coroner, Dr. Elias Vance, found no signs of a struggle. You talk about a suspicious death, but you fail to mention the doctor's conclusion that Anders Kincaid was drunk and killed by his own shoddy workmanship. You talk about my wife fleeing, but you fail to mention she was a terrified widow with a rich, powerful family trying to blame her for their own son's foolish death." He looked around the room, at the faces of his neighbors. "You all look at her and you see someone different, someone big, someone you don't understand, and it scares you. It's easier to believe she's a monster than to believe she's just a woman who has been alone and afraid." He turned his gaze inward, and his voice dropped, becoming raw and intensely personal. "I know something about being alone, and I know about being afraid. I was in a war. I saw things that would turn your hair white. I came back from that war a broken man, in more ways than one. I learned not to trust anyone or anything. I locked myself away, content to let myself and my ranch rot into the dust." He paused, finally allowing himself to look at Magda. Her eyes were wide, glistening with unshed tears. "And then she came," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This woman, She came into my broken-down life, and she didn't see a cripple. She saw a man. She took the shambles of my home, and with her own 2 hands, she started to build it back. She took the silence I lived in, and she filled it with peace. You call her a monster? You fools. This woman has more strength, more courage, and more simple goodness in her than this entire town put together. She didn't just mend my fences. She started to mend my soul. "This is sentimental nonsense," Tucker shouted, seeing he was losing the crowd. "She's an ogress, a witch who has clearly put a spell on him." Boone turned back to Tucker, a slow, dangerous smile on his lips. "You want to talk about witches?" He walked the final step to Magda's chair. He reached down and took her large, calloused hand, pulling her gently to her feet. He intertwined his fingers with hers, holding her hand up for the entire room to see. A public, defiant declaration. Her hand trembled in his, but she stood tall beside him, their shoulders almost touching. He looked straight into Jedediah Tucker's eyes, his voice dropping to a deadly serious whisper that seemed to suck all the air out of the room. "If she is a witch," Boone said, his gaze sweeping over the stunned crowd, "then burn me with her." Absolute silence. The words hung in the air, a challenge so profound, so utterly final, that no one dared to breathe. The mob mentality shattered, broken by the simple, undeniable power of his conviction. In that moment, he was not a cripple, and she was not a giantess. They were simply a man and a woman, united against the world. Sheriff Brody stared at them, his mouth slightly agape. He looked at the report in Boone's hand, at the venomous, defeated look on Jedediah Tucker's face, and at the 2 people standing together in the center of the room. He cleared his throat and stood up, banging his fist on the table. "This is not a court of law," he declared, his voice full of a newfound authority. "There are no charges from Nebraska. There is no evidence of a crime here. There is only hearsay and bad blood." He looked directly at Magda. "Mrs. Coulter, you are free to go." A collective sigh went through the room. The tension broke. Jedediah Tucker sputtered in protest, but no one was listening anymore. Boone, still holding Magda's hand, turned and led her through the parting crowd. The whispers that followed them this time were not of ridicule, but of awe. They walked out of the saloon and into the bright, clean sunlight, together. The ride back to the ranch was a long, silent pilgrimage. They sat side by side on the buckboard, the reins loose in Boone's hands, old Samson plotting a slow, steady rhythm that seemed to match the new, calmer beat of their hearts. The sun was warm on their faces, the harsh glare of midday softened by a sense of profound and weary relief. For the first time since Magda's arrival, Boone reached across the space between them and took her hand. He did not speak. He simply enveloped her large, capable hand in his calloused thumb stroking the back of her knuckles. She did not pull away. She laced her fingers through his, their joined hands resting on his thigh. A solid, tangible anchor in a world that had just been upended. They had been changed by the fire, both of them. The trial in the saloon had not been a legal proceeding. It had been a crucible. It had burned away the last of Boone's doubt and Magda's stoic resignation. He looked at her now, at her strong profile outlined against the vast, empty landscape, and he saw not a stranger or a mystery, but the other half of his own soul. He had stood before the town and declared his allegiance, and in doing so, he had finally declared it to himself. He was no longer just a man who had acquired a wife. He was a husband. The word felt new and weighty and right. Magda, for her part, felt a strange and unfamiliar lightness. All her life, she had managed her father's cold expectations, her first husband's loveless rule, and the world's judgment of her size and strength. She had built a fortress around her heart, not of malice, but of pure, stubborn endurance. To endure was to survive. But what Boone had done in that saloon was something her fortress had no defense against. He had not just defended her, he had claimed her, scars and all. He had seen the whispers and the hatred, and he had chosen to stand with her in the fire. For the first time, she felt she did not have to simply manage. She could live. She understood now that love was not a soft, fleeting feeling peddled in stories. It was a choice. It was a rugged, difficult, conscious decision to stand your ground, to hold a hand in the darkness, and to say, "Your fight is my fight." When they crested the last rise and the small, familiar shape of the cabin came into view, it looked different. It no longer seemed a monument to decay and loneliness. Bathed in the golden light of the late afternoon, it looked like a promise. It looked like home. He pulled the buckboard to a stop, and for a long moment, they simply sat and looked at it. He helped her down, his hand lingering at her waist. They walked to the door together, their steps in sync. When they crossed the threshold into the cool dimness of the cabin, the air was still and peaceful. The cold stew and untouched bread still sat on the table, relics of a past that already felt a lifetime away. Magda turned to him, her blue eyes searching his face. "Boone," she began, her voice soft. "What you said, in that place, I meant every word," he said, his voice thick. "And I am sorry. Magda, forgive me for my doubt, for my cowardice. I was a fool who almost threw away the only good thing that has ever happened to him." She reached up and gently touched the scar on his cheek, the same spot her fingers had lingered on that night he had pulled away. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. "You were a man afraid. I have been a woman afraid my whole life. Today you taught me how not to be." He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that held none of the frantic desperation of their first encounter. It was a kiss of deep, abiding tenderness, of gratitude, of a new and sacred beginning. It was a promise made without words. The next morning, Boone woke with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He looked at the narrow rope cot they had shared, the frame groaning under their combined weight, the mattress a lumpy landscape of compromise. It was a bed for one lonely, broken man. It was a bed for his past. "This won't do," he declared, his voice ringing with a newfound energy. He threw off the blanket and stood, his bad leg feeling stronger than it had in a decade. Magda, stirring from sleep, looked at him with a drowsy, questioning smile. "What will not do?" "This," he said, gesturing to the cot with disgust. "A man's home should have a proper bed, a marriage bed." And so, he began to build. He rode out to the small stand of cottonwoods that grew near the creek bed, the toughest, most resilient trees on his property. He spent the day felling two of the straightest, strongest trunks, the rhythmic thud of his axe a song of creation. He was not just cutting down trees, he was harvesting the raw material of their future. He worked for the next week with a single-minded devotion. It was an act of penance and a labor of love. He sawed the thick trunks into heavy, solid planks. He planed them by hand, stripping away the rough bark to reveal the smooth, pale wood beneath, the muscles in his arms and back burning with a satisfying ache. He was building something to last. Magda did not just watch. She worked alongside him. Her strength was not a spectacle now, but a partnership. She helped him lift the heavy beams, her power a perfect complement to his skill. She held the posts steady as he drilled the holes for the dowels, her hands sure and unwavering. They worked in a comfortable, easy silence, punctuated by the scrape of the plane and the rasp of the saw. They were building more than a bed. They were weaving the fabric of their life together, each contributing their own thread. He built the frame thick and strong, with 4 solid posts that stood like the cornerstones of a new foundation. The headboard was a single, wide plank of wood, its grain as unique and beautiful as a fingerprint. He sanded every surface until it was as smooth as river stone, warm and inviting to the touch. He fashioned a new mattress, stuffing a heavy canvas sack not with lumpy straw, but with wild grasses and horsehair, making it thick and resilient. When it was finished, it dominated the small cabin. It was a magnificent, formidable piece of furniture, easily twice the size of the old cot, built to hold two people not in compromise, but in comfort. It was an anchor, a statement. It was a bed that said, asterisk, this is a home for two. They moved it into place as the sun was setting, the last rays of light slanting through the window and setting the pale wood aglow. They stood back, admiring their handiwork, their shoulders touching. The little cabin, with its mended roof, its clean floor, and now this grand, solid bed, felt complete. It felt like a fortress of warmth and safety. Boone looked at Magda. Her face was soft in the twilight, her eyes shining. The weary, guarded woman he had met on the train platform was gone. In her place was a woman radiant with a quiet, powerful joy. She turned her head, her gaze moving from the new bed back to him. A slow, gentle smile spread across her lips, a smile full of love and a shared, secret history. She looked him up and down, a playful glint in her blue eyes. "It's still a bit small," she said, her voice a low, teasing murmur. She paused, her smile widening. "But I'll manage tonight." Boone let out a laugh, a deep, genuine sound of pure happiness. The weight of 7 years of pain and solitude seemed to lift from his shoulders in that one single moment. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms around her waist and pulling her tight against him, burying his face in the soft cloud of her hair. "You don't have to manage alone anymore," he whispered into her ear, his voice thick with a promise that was meant to last a lifetime. She wrapped her strong arms around him, holding him with a fierce and gentle strength. They stood there, locked in an embrace in the center of their small, defiant home, as the wind howled its lonely sermon across the high desert outside. But they did not hear loneliness in its cry. They heard only the wild, free song of the land they now called theirs, the closing chapter of a journey of two wounded souls who, against all odds, had finally, blessedly, found their way home. Thank you so much for listening to our story. It means the world to us. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, for more stories like this one, and please feel free to share your thoughts. We read every one.